Smash Ultimate has been out for quite a while now, and much like any fighting game, the metagame has evolved quite a lot since release. We have seen characters rise and fall in popularity, while some have proven their strength by being ever-prevalent meta threats. Much like its predecessor Smash 4, every once in a while we get a patch. These usually coincide with the release of a new DLC character, as it's a good time to make wanted changes, though this is not always the case. Their purpose is quite self-explanatory, to change aspects about the game and the characters within it, and so far we have seen quite a few. However, in my opinion, a lot of them have been pretty subpar, or at least have missed the mark in a lot of areas. And that's what I want to talk about here today, because it didn't always used to be like this. So join me as we take a look at the history and potential future of Smash patches. Now, when talking about patches, a good place to start would be why a game gets patched to begin with. Patches to games have been around for quite a while now, and more often than not, they serve as a way for the developers to make changes to the game after it has been released. This is mostly to fix bugs and glitches or to add and tweak certain aspects about the game. It's usually not a huge deal for most games without a metagame, but for fighting games like Smash, it can actually have pretty significant ramifications on the game, in the form of the elusive balance patch. Depending on what character you play, the mere mention of a balance patch might send chills down your spine or fill your heart with hope. It's the time to even the odds, bring down the titans and uplift the weak. It's when new life is granted to those who need it the most, and is taken away from those who abuse it. Or at least it kind of used to be like that. Smash 4 was the first game to ever receive patches, and throughout its life it had a total of 9 significant balance patches, and boy did it need it. Not only was the game a host to many glitches, but the game also had a lot of, let's just say, broken characters throughout its life. The patches continued into Smash Ultimate, and at the moment it's still unclear exactly how many patches we're going to get. There are still DLC characters yet to be released, and that means at least one patch each. So in a sense we are about halfway through the patches for Ultimate, and well, I think they have been pretty lacking so far. And when I say that, I know a lot of you probably go, what do you mean? They are buffing low tiers and nerfing top tiers. What more can you expect? They are clearly trying to balance the game. And in a sense, yes, that is correct. They are trying to change characters that are bad for the better and making sure good characters are not too good. But it's more so the way they go about it that I don't really like. So, let me explain. First of all, let me touch on the concept of balance in fighting games, and how patches are supposed to complement it. It's something I think a lot of people seem to misunderstand. What I see very often when the subject is brought up is the idea that balance in fighting games is all about making sure every character is equally powerful or equally viable. While this is a nice thought, and it would be great if it were the case, there are a lot of reasons why this simply is not feasible. I'm not going to go too much into it here since I could probably make an entirely separate video on the topic, but the basic rundown is that if you want any form of character diversity in your game, it is bar none impossible to balance those against each other. Any drastic character difference between the characters will push one character to being better than the other no matter what. It is close to impossible to quantify the power differences between two characters and then try to equalize them. There are just too many moving parts in what makes a character good or bad. And in a game with a roster as expansive as Smash Ultimate, it's just not a thing that's going to happen. It's also important to realize that the job of the people in charge of balancing Smash, or any other competitive game for that matter, is first and foremost to make sure that no character is overpowered or broken. Because from a developer standpoint, balance is pretty cut and dry. As long as that box is checked, at the end of the day, their job is kinda done. The consequences of having a character be way too good or over-centralizing the metagame is way worse than 10 or 20 characters not quite having the sauce. We need not look further back in the latter half of Smash 4 to find evidence of this. Bayonetta being a good example to say the least, where the failure to balance a character led to extreme consequences for the metagame. I am bringing all of this up to put into perspective why I feel the way I do about Smash Ultimate's patches, because Smash Ultimate is one of the rare Smash games to simply release without any character being too good or overpowered, and has stayed that way without the need for major nerfs despite new characters being added to the game. Now, this is the part where you can point at your least favorite top tier and explain why they are slightly better than the second best character in the game and therefore are broken, but I don't believe this is the case. I think the current Ultimate metagame is about the healthiest Smash metagame we have ever seen in any Smash game ever, and just looking at tournament results and character diversity, it's very evident. We see lots of different characters in top 8s, and there's truly no character that is regarded to be the obvious best one in the game. Sure, some characters are better than others, but the relative amount of actually viable characters compared to most other Smash games is really high. With all this in mind, the idea that Smash Ultimate needs better patches might seem a little strange, because from where we are now, the game is fine and does not really need to be changed really. While there are some aspects of characters I really would not mind them toning down a bit, like Waft, Pikachu low profiling, Palutena, there's no drastic need for it. And it seems like Nintendo is aware of this and has been extremely reluctant to change much about the game. To say that they have played it safe is almost an understatement. The amount of top tiers that has ever been changed at all is really low, and even when they do get nerfed, it's so slight that it really doesn't matter for them and they still reign supreme. None of them have really dropped as a result of any nerfs. This is again fine since I don't believe any of the characters really need it. However, it seems this mentality of being very careful has bled into the process of buffing characters as well. This is where I start having some problems with Ultimate's patches. To put it bluntly, the buffs they are handing out in most of these patches are just poor. They are either very weak or are just in the wrong places, making them insignificant in the long run. And a lot of them just do not play much to the character's strengths or weaknesses. If you've been following me for a while and have watched my patch reviews when they come out, you're probably aware of the fact that very few of the buffs really did it for me. And I've said in the past that I do not believe a lot of the buffs characters got would notably impact their tier list placing or viability in the long run. So allow me to explain my stance on this in a bit more detail. I believe that if you're going to buff a character, you should do so impactfully. Like, what is even the point of bothering to buff a character if the intent is not to make them at least notably better than before? In my eyes, there's not really much of a point of ever changing a character if you're just going to change them in ways that do not matter. For example, if next patch Mac gets a buff where all of his aerials deal 3% more damage, it would technically be a buff. He would technically be better than before. But in practice, the buffs are so poorly placed that they're not going to make much of a difference in the long run. It might as well have not even been changed at all. Of course, not all the ramifications of balance changes are going to be as easy to grasp as this example. And I'm not saying that I somehow understand 100% of how all buffs will impact characters, but I do hope you understand where I'm coming from here. When I say despite a character receiving a buff, it does not necessarily mean they are better than before. Compared to Smash 4, their willingness to make substantial buffs is very reluctant. In Ultimate, it seems they are pretty much restricted themselves to only change aspects about the move frame data. Believe it or not, the only change to character attributes that has ever happened in any of Ultimate's patches was in patch 3.0 where Mewtwo had his weight changed by 2 units. That's it. No airspeed, run speed, walk speed, air acceleration, fall speed, gravity, jump height. It's all like it was the day the game launched. It seems they have arbitrarily made the decision to not ever change anything about any character's attributes, which gives them a lot less flexibility in how they can buff characters. This is again not something they were scared of doing in Smash 4, but for some reason they just don't want to go near an Ultimate. In Smash 4 they would often do patches where they focused on a handful of characters and try to improve them in many different ways, both attributes and relevant moves in combination, in order to make the buffed character truly feel fresh. After a character in Smash 4 got a real overhaul, they would often not only go up an entire tier or two, but they would also just feel way better to play. It was truly something special. You would look at their change list and often they would have about 7 or 8 or even more changes in total. So even if a few of them miss, some are likely to hit. When a character in Smash 4 got buffed, it really looked like they tried to make them better. And you can tell just by looking at the changes they did make. However, in Ultimate they seem very complacent in just buffing characters enough to the point where they can say that they buffed them, but not in such a way where they're realistically going to get much better. A few frames less lag here, a few frames less startup there, random move deals more damage, and that's it. And this is really how a lot of Ultimate's patches have been so far. It feels like not a lot of thought went into what characters and what aspects of them should be changed. It seems like every patch they just bring out the buff shotgun and fire off a few rounds, and sure, every once in a while a few hit, but it's mostly misses. Though I do have to admit that there are a few cases where it clearly does seem like some real thought went into the changes. A great example of this is patch 8.0 where Marth had his tipper hitboxes adjusted. It's obvious that whoever decided this change understands that this is not only a relevant aspect of Marth, but also an area of his character that was holding him back. Even if the change is not going to skyrocket Marth to top tier, it's at least a very appropriate and focused buff. Buffs like these are great. Meanwhile, in the same patch, K. Rool got more knockback on up smash and more knockback on dash attack. Like, what's that going to accomplish? Not only is the knockback increase just minuscule, but in terms of his character, it's just really not what he needs. Buffs like these just lack focus. They don't really look at what the character needs to be better, but just buffs random aspects of them and call it a day. Instead of experimenting and thinking about how they can improve characters and make them have different playstyles, they just opt for making pointless buffs to moves that don't really need it or that are not really relevant. A single good focused buff can change everything about a character. Back in Smash 4, Bowser was for the longest time considered a low to mid tier character. He had a good neutral and advantage state, along with some really powerful moves and an extremely good grab. However, he never really got too much out of it, since he had no grab combos or any other moves that can reliably set up into anything. In patch 1.1.3, they changed just a single move about him that suddenly made him a solid high tier character and a real threat. They changed his up throw, so that now it combos into up air. A single tiny change was enough to single-handedly make him good, because he already had a lot of the tools he needed, but was missing this exact thing. This singular change was exactly what he needed. They could have given him 2 less frames of lag on every move he had and make them deal 1 more damage across the board, and it would still not be as good as a single change to his up throw. So when you see very common ultimate buffs like a character has their up smash come out 2 frames faster, or an F tilt has 3 less frames of lag, or an up tilt have more knockback, unless those changes directly result in a new potential combo, gives the move some sort of new utility, or makes the move kill noticeably earlier, it's very unlikely to make a difference for the character in the long run, since the change didn't have much direction to begin with. Like, okay, when I now use my up smash randomly to try to catch a landing, it comes out 2 frames faster. Cool. Or my F tilt has 3 less frames of lag. It still does not combo or kill, and is still unsafe on shield. But hey, 3 frames less lag. Or up tilt now has more knockback. It kills like 2% earlier. Like, okay, cool. Nice. It's not like changes like these can't be great. If a character is 3 frames off being able to combo their up tilt into their up air, then removing 4 frames of lag from that tilt would be a huge change. Suddenly new potential for combos is available, but if you only remove 2 frames, then who cares? Almost nothing has changed. The move now just has 2 less frames of lag, and nothing else is different. You see how something as minuscule as just 2 frames can actually matter so much, when it's actually in a relevant context. In this sense it is a bit binary, either the change actually matters or it doesn't. The move in a majority of cases is just the same move it was before, but a number is slightly lower. There will of course always be 1 or 2 interactions where a change like this will be relevant, but it's not really something significant enough to the point where you can rely on it or change your playstyle. I'm of course not saying that I want every patch for characters to suddenly get super powerful combo tools like Bowser did, but when they have arbitrarily limited themselves to pretty much only changing the frame data of moves, the amount of ways they can go about impactfully changing characters is very low. And the reason it bothers me so much is not the fact that the buffs are necessarily just bad or unfocused. At the end of the day, nothing is lost when a buff falls flat, but it's just that Ultimate is in such a healthy state that it absolutely could handle some experimentation when it comes to the patches. So it just feels like they're wasting their opportunity to do so, by not really doing anything. This is why I'm generally not very impressed with a lot of the past buffs Ultimate has delivered. They are either extremely safe, or just land in the wrong places, and often both. I would much rather have 4 or 5 characters that really got buffed well and made it feel like the characters got really overhauled, instead of 10 to 20 characters getting changed in small minuscule ways like we do now. But again, that is just the way I at least prefer it. If you like having a lot of characters changed every patch, I get that. Spreading more of the love, so to say. But I at least think there is a lot more to be gained from doing more focused and impactful patches. Obviously, I am not the great arbiter of what a good change or not is. Smash is a very complex game with a ton of moving pieces, and there is just too much going on for me to be able to make a 100% accurate guess of every character change to every character every patch. But generally speaking, I think I have been pretty accurate just looking back at the patches that have been. Now, I've been mentioning Smash 4 patches a lot in this video, and I think it's about time we look at some examples, now that I've made my stance quite clear. I'll be going through all the patches that were released for Ultimate, and talk about some of the notable things about them and generally how they compare to Smash 4 patches. I'll only be covering the big patches since they are really the only ones that actually have balance changes in them, and are not just bug fixes. I won't be going character by character since I do want this video to be less than 2 hours long, but enough to the point where you can get the gist of how the patches were. So, let's begin. The first patch Ultimate got was the Day 1 patch, which did actually change a few things about some characters. It's very minuscule changes, and as far as I can find there were no official patch notes released for it either. It's mostly just fixes and stuff. But one pretty huge nerf that I did see is the nerf to Mii Sword Fighters Chakram and Tornado, which, I kid you not, used to go across the entirety of Final Destination, but were changed to go only halfway across after the patch. It's honestly one of the most drastic nerfs I think any character in Ultimate has ever gotten. I can't imagine the nightmare this character would have been if they didn't change this. Aside from that, the patch is very unremarkable. I guess this was mostly just a bug fix patch more so than anything else, since the metagame had hardly even gotten started, so it makes sense. There's not too much to say about it, honestly. 2.0 came out about 2 months after the game released, and it's the first patch that actually tried to do some balance changing. The meta had kinda settled, and it shows that they were aware of the characters that kinda lacked power. This is the first time we got to see a strange pattern with how they're doing patches going forward. When they make a new patch, they always seem to centralize it around a loose theme of sorts. This time the theme was changing the ledge grab lockout timer of a bunch of of moves, which basically means how long it takes before you are allowed to grab the ledge after using a move. The window was changed on a lot of characters for a few moves. It's strange because it's such an irrelevant aspect of Smash that the fact that they even bother to change it really confuses me. Like, most people don't use aerials close to the ledge just so they don't have to run the risk of getting hit and die off stage. But you also need to do it a fair amount of time before you are at the ledge because the move has lag, so it's unlikely that you'll even hit anything. Like, most people just drift back away from the ledge until they can grab it with a special move. It doesn't help that the changes made were made only by a few frames, which in other words is just a fraction of a second. It's very strange, but what else is new from these patches? There were obviously other changes to characters as well, but a lot of the changes were mostly fixes more so than buffs. If you don't count the fixes, which I suppose technically do count as buffs, but I do like to keep them separated since it's just a fix to a move that was supposed to work like this to begin with, as opposed to them trying to improve the character. Most characters that got buffed got maybe 1 or 2 move changes, and again in small or irrelevant ways. The only thing I'd say is a really good change is the buff to Incineroar's up B, which was pretty noticeable and significant. It's obviously easy for me to look back at these changes in hindsight, judging them now knowing what consequences they had for the characters. But when comparing the changes made all the way back then to most of the changes we see in a patch released today, they are still very similar. We'll see more of this as we move along. Patch 3.0 was released on April 17th, and was the patch that added Joker into the game. It, much like the previous patch, had a very noticeable theme, this time it being the make projectiles deal less shield damage patch, where across the board projectiles had their shield damage lowered, in order to make shields not break as easily, which I suppose is fair enough. Aside from that, the amount of changes this time around was actually quite low. Only a few characters really got changed, but when they did, it was actually quite a few changes. Like, Mewtwo got quite a lot of changes, but when you actually start looking at the buffs, they just don't amass too much at all. It's a little ironic that back in Smash 4, Mewtwo found himself in a pretty similar situation, of kind of lacking some stuff, and they received a patch that changed them up a bit. Except in Smash 4, it resulted in Mewtwo being considered a high tier character, while nothing really happened as a result of the Ultimate patch. So why is this? Well, the Smash 4 patch was not only pushed a little harder, Mewtwo was a DLC character, which means that they were more willing to push their viability. But the changes, once again, were just focused and appropriate for what the character needed. There was also just a lot of changes. Attributes were changed, he was made faster, stronger, pretty much everything he needed to utilize his potential, but in Ultimate the same thing did not happen. Obviously the buffs were not nearly as powerful, but again here the fact that they don't want to change attributes is hurting them. When you look through the many patches of Smash 4, you'll see plenty of changes like this. It was pretty usual back then, but in Ultimate I kinda get surprised every time I see a single character get more than 3 changes alone. Aside from that, the patch really did not have a lot going on. There were a few changes to characters like Kirby, Sheik, and Corrin, but again nothing major that really affected them in the long run. On May 30th, 3.1 came out, which added functionality for VR Labo thing. I never really understand what that whole thing was about. But more importantly, it had balance changes. And this is one of the few patches where they actually went pretty hard on the nerfs, actually notably nerfing some characters people have been complaining about for a while like Pichu and Olimar, while also dishing out some pretty alright buffs to a handful of characters. Most of it though, yet again, is not something that affected these characters much. The one I would say might actually have made an impact is the buff for Shotos. But that is probably more so the fact that I can never really get a good grasp on those characters. It's very hard to gauge the ramifications of tilts now being able to cancel into moves at the time. Like, I don't know if that's gonna be good or not, but given that despite being buffed several times in patches like this and future ones, their placement is still about the same as it's always been. It probably wasn't exactly what they needed. There are several characters like this that, despite being buffed several times across several patches, still can't get their footing. And I can't help but think about the Bowser change I mentioned earlier. We'll have a look at these characters as we continue. On July 30th, patch 4.0 was released. I guess they just really like releasing these on the 30th of a month. This was the patch that introduced Hero, but also did bring along some balance changes. This patch had almost no nerfs at all, the only one really being Ivysaur. But then again, it wasn't a huge nerf, and in the same patch they did buff Charizard, so I guess it kind of evens out. The patch mainly focused on buffing bottom to mid-tier characters, the most notable of which being Mewtwo, Pitts, Corrin, Ridley, Isabelle, and Piranha Plant. And as you might expect, it did not really help them much. They are still in the same spot they were back then today. It's the same story as all the other patches. A hitbox now lasts 2 frames longer, move now deals a few more units of knockback, a few moves have less landing lag, all of which are nice changes, but just get lost in the greater machinery that is a character's viability. 5.0 was released on September 4th and was the patch that introduced Banjo. The patch itself had pretty much no balance changes at all. I guess they just didn't want to make one this time. There's a few minor bug fixes, but that's about it. So let's move on. Our next patch 6.0 was released on November 6th, and was the patch that introduced Terry. It, unlike the previous patch, did actually include some balance changes. However, it was not really a particularly big patch. It only really focused on 6 characters, those being DK, Kirby, Jigglypuff, Robin, K. Rool, and Incineroar. As you'll notice, it's very frequently the same characters getting buffed over and over. This is now the 3rd time Kirby has been buffed, and even after this he still has not gotten any better. However, it would be nice if they actually decided to share the love with some of the bottom to mid-tier characters that could use it. Though if the changes are going to be like this, I guess it doesn't really matter that much. DK buffs were nice, Nair is a pretty relevant move, but it's again just not enough to make a difference. Puff buffs were okay. Like, Puff is a character that just needs so much more than this to be good. It's just not enough. Yet again, we see Incineroar and K. Rool in the buff booth. And again, it's just them buffing their strength when what plagues them is just how exploitable these characters' weaknesses are. Just not making much of a difference. 7.0 was released on January 28th, and was the patch that arrived alongside Byleth. We are now arriving in the territory of patches I have covered in separate videos when they came out. So if you want a bit more of a detailed explanation on the different changes, I would recommend watching those. This is honestly one of the most confusing patches for me for a lot of reason. First off, this was the patch where they finally decided to do something about the shield poking problem players had been complaining about for a long time. This was a problem that applied to every character in the game, where shields simply did not cover the characters properly a lot of the time. So how would you go about fixing this? Well, of course by giving characters bigger shields. But only half the cast got the buff. For some reason, despite this being a problem that applies to everyone, they decided to just apply it to some characters. I cannot begin to express how astronomically baffling this decision is. Not only are they aware of the problem, but by all means it looks like they intend to fix it. And then this is what they do. This means that the shield poking still happens. Every character that did not have their shield improved in this patch still suffer from it. It's so dumb. But okay, maybe there is still a chance that they'll fix it in the future. As far as balance changes go, there were quite a few. This patch tried to do a few nerfs for 3 characters, Joker, Zero Suit Samus, and Palutena. They were not super huge, but the biggest was probably the gun nerfs for Joker. Aside from that, there weren't really any huge takedowns. For some reason, they decided to almost exclusively buff characters that are already good and mostly didn't really need it. In this patch, characters like Cloud, Samus, Ryu, Ken, Young Link, and Toon Link received buffs. Characters that are already in the mid to high tier range. Again, the buffs weren't super huge, but the effect of the small buffs are usually amplified on characters that are already good, since they usually have stronger game plans and more flexibility in what moves they can use. Aside from that, to the dismay of every online player ever, Zelda received some buffs. Same is true of Sheik and Dr. Mario. Finally, we have 8.0, which is the most recent balance patch as of making this video, not counting the small battlefield patch since that didn't have any balance changes. It released on June 29th and added Min Min into the game. Again, I covered this patch when it released, so for a more in-depth look, go watch that. This patch is probably the biggest patch we had ever gotten, judging just by the sheer amount of different changes it brought. A lot of characters were touched in this patch, including Kirby, Falcon, Falco, Mewtwo, Meta Knight, Pets, Ike, Diddy Kong, Dedede, Villager, Wii Fit Trainer, Corrin, Bayonetta, Isabelle, K. Rool, Incineroar, and Plant. Quite the list, in other words. One of the changes I kind of want to talk about here is the changes to Ike. Ike had his up B knockback buffed by a total of 40 units of knockback, which is way more than the usual 4 or 5 units of knockback they usually hand out. This is a substantial buff. The move feels very different than it did before, and now serves a totally different function than it did before. Granted, I still don't think this buff is super good for Ike. It's not like Ike ever struggled to kill before the patch, and up B is still a pretty clunky and slow move to land. But I will at least admit that the buff is substantial. The change is noticeable, and I like that about it. On the other side, this is the 4th patch Kirby, Incineroar, and Corrin had been buffed. The 3rd patch Plant, Mewtwo, and Diddy Kong have been buffed, and they still stay stagnant, despite several buffs over several patches. You would believe that after receiving so many buffs, the characters would have to be better, but no, it's just not the case. Most of these characters are still in the same spot they were the day the game launched. Now, of course, it has not really been long enough since the release of this patch to truly tell if these changes have much of an impact or not. It certainly doesn't help that there haven't been any major tournaments pretty much all year because of the current situation we find ourselves in. But comparing the changes in this patch to the changes in the past, the pattern still looks about the same. It's the same story of moves dealing more knockback and moves having less lag. Which, given how it panned out in the past, I don't really have too much of a reason to believe it would turn out any differently now. Lots of these changes are nice. but I don't see how most of them are going to change anything about the character's metagames. However, that is all the patches. So this is where we are today. In closing, I just want to reiterate that I don't have a problem with these patches because they aren't hurting anything about the metagame. Like I said, a bad patch is ultimately harmless. All that is lost is the potential for something better. I just want patches where the changes made to the characters are apparent and have some sort of goal set behind them. I want the balance team to sit down and think about what they want to do with a character, what direction they want to take them, and then try to shape changes from there, instead of buffing some random moves and hoping it maybe has an impact on the character. I've seen it time and time again. A new patch drops and everyone gets really excited because their character got buffed. A few weeks go by and the dust settles. The buffed characters don't really go anywhere, and the people who play them slowly go back to complaining about the characters being bad. And I think this is where a lot of Smash 4 patches shine through. They did a lot of changes right and were willing to take risks with the balance of the game. Of course, not every Smash 4 patch was a home run hit, but they at least felt like they tried to be. And in Ultimate, I don't get the same feeling that they do. We still have quite a long time left until Ultimate is done being patched. Who knows what the future of Smash patches will bring? You can probably tell what direction I want to take things, but there's no way to predict the future. I do think patch 8.0, despite its shortcomings, is a step in the right direction. Some of the changes in that patch do feel like they're aiming for something. I can't always tell what, but something for sure. I'll be continuing to cover patches as they come out. They're always a lot of fun to talk about. So in due time we'll see how things turn out. But for the moment I want to thank you for hearing me out here. I always hate to be the guy who rains on everyone's parade every time a new patch is out, but I still think it is better than me pretending they are good. But I hope in watching this you at least get where I'm coming from, and why I have a bit of a problem with Ultimate's patches. Either way, I think that's about all I got. So, if you want to see how I feel about future patches, sticking around is the way to go. But, until then, thank you so much for watching.